I'd like to thank Joel Fishman of the JCPA and Ahuva, who has done wonders with organising this conference. I've got one complaint, Ahuva, and that is never again put me after Andrew Roberts. Virtually impossible to follow such a great speaker and a great historian. It always is a huge pleasure and honour to be here in your great country of Israel. I do want to take issue with a point that Dory Gold made a short while ago, because I disagree with him when he said that Britain should not apologise for the Balfour Declaration. I agree with President Abbas that Britain should apologise for the Balfour Declaration. And the apology should be for failing to implement the Balfour Declaration rapidly and failing to enthusiastically support the declaration when it eventually was implemented fully in 1948. Ladies and gentlemen, Hanit is the Hebrew word that means spearhead. I think it's actually pronounced Hanit, but I can't do the ch, so it's Hanit. And that one word explains why Israel is a vital strategic asset, not just to Great Britain, but to the West as a whole. And Hanita is also the name of a settlement established in the Western Galilee in 1938. Geographically, Hanita is literally the spearhead of Israel, hard up against the front line with Lebanon. Hanita's story encapsulates Britain's long-standing and too often dishonourable relationship with the Jews of Palestine and the State of Israel. When the establishment of Hanita was proposed, the British administration vetoed it and then did everything in their power to prevent it from going ahead. Despite many obstacles thrown into their path, the Jews persisted, and the tower and stockade village of Hanita was eventually built. And this occurred during the Arab Revolt. And on their way, on their very first night at Hanita, the young pioneers had to fight off wave after wave of savage attacks by hundreds of Bedouin raiders who were intent on annihilating them. But they survived, and 2 years later, in 1940, the very same British authorities that had forbidden the settlement and done everything they could to stop it came to Hanita for help. Britain planned to invade Syria to prevent the Vichy French government there from allowing a German army to build up and threaten the Mosul oil fields and the Suez Canal. An Australian force was going to enter Lebanon from Palestine using the forbidden Hanita as a base, and from there advance into Syria. And bridges over the Litani River were vital for the operation. And because of their familiarity with the wild and uncharted border country, the Jews were asked to capture and hold those bridges to prevent their destruction by the Vichy forces before the Australians arrived. In the event, 50 young Jewish farmers from Hanita held the bridges for 7 hours and repulsed 10 mass attacks before the Australian regular troops eventually arrived. In the final onslaught, having suffered over 50% casualties, the Jews fought off their heavily armed attackers with knives, bricks, crowbars, revolvers, and when they ran out of bullets, with their bare hands. This was the operation in which Moshe Dayan, later Chief of Staff, Defense Minister, and Foreign Minister of Israel, lost his left eye. On a different level, we saw a similarly duplicitous game played out again only at the end of last year. In a speech in London last December, the British Prime Minister Theresa May strongly asserted the value that Israel has to Britain. She said, and I quote, "Israel will be crucial to us as we exit the EU. We have common values, we work together on health, counter-terrorism, cybersecurity, technology, and we can help each other achieve our aims. When we work together on our mutual security at the highest level, it makes the world safer." But then just a few days after making that speech, Theresa May's government supported an unprecedented and devastatingly anti-Israel resolution at the United Nations Security Council, which gave heart to Israel's enemies and strengthened the hand of the BDS movement that want to destroy her. Unfortunately, this perfidious attitude has been the consistent approach by Britain, first to the Jewish settlers in Palestine during the Mandate and later to the Jewish state. But in the operation launched from the settlement of Hanita, these pioneers of the State of Israel had proved to be a vital strategic asset to Great Britain, as had their own forerunners 25 years earlier, when so many Palestinian Jews played a significant role in the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, fighting with the Zion Mule Corps, and 2 years later, when the Jewish Legion of the British Army, the first formed Jewish fighting force since the Maccabees, helped defeat the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Megiddo in 1918. As had the Jews of Nili, which provided vital intelligence to General Allenby's forces during his First World War Palestine campaign, in some cases at the cost of their lives. After the role Hanita played in securing crucial territory for the British, other Jews also went on to play a vital strategic role in the war against Rommel's army, a role that still goes largely unrecognized today. The British Eighth Army included 30,000 Jewish volunteers, many of whom carried out extraordinary acts of heroism and devotion to duty in the face of horrific adversity. The British Army was supported by 200,000 Palestinian industrial workers and farmers and thousands more doctors, dentists and nurses. 7,000 factories and vast acres of agricultural land were placed at the disposal of British Empire forces fighting in North Africa. This was the product of the Zionism encouraged by the Balfour Declaration and the product of the British Empire's subsequent conquest of the land of Palestine. In the words of Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who was the real hand behind Balfour, in a speech in 1931 he said, "Zionism has brought to an old land, a renowned but ruined old land, new wealth, new energy, new purpose, new initiative, new intelligence, a new devotion, and a new hope. Zionism has not finished its task, far from it, but it has already accomplished so much as to demonstrate that the land flowing with milk and honey was no baseless legend." This land of milk and honey supplied the British Army with virtually every kind of food, material, and equipment that an army needed. And critically, it did not have to be transported through the dangerous seas with submarine wolfpacks lurking beneath. There is no question that the Jews of Palestine were a vital strategic asset for General Montgomery and Britain in the North Africa campaign, which had a decisive effect on the progress and the eventual outcome of the war. Yet despicably, as the Jews stood shoulder to shoulder with the British during the dark days of that war, Britain continued to restrict immigration into Palestine. Immigration that could have saved so many of their brothers and sisters from extermination at the hands of the Nazis. Even after the British rejected the United Nations' decision to create a Jewish state and provided a British general to lead the Arab Legion in the invasion of Israel at its birth, the Palestinian Jews remained staunch and steadfast allies and friends. If anything, Israel's strategic value to Great Britain and the world has increased dramatically since those early days of 1917 and the 1940s. But three major events influenced a growing dependency on Israel. First, 9/11, when the Islamic terror threat became a reality for many Western nations and caused several states to become involved militarily in various Middle Eastern and South Asian contingencies against terrorist insurgencies. Second, the financial crisis of 2008, which led Western governments to cut their defense and security budgets, often hollowing out their military and intelligence services. And among the consequences of that was a reduction in attention to what was happening in the Middle East, a misappreciation of the so-called Arab Spring, and a failure to anticipate the expansion of radical Islamism in the region. Third, the rise of the Islamic State and an explosion of immigration into European countries, together bringing to the cities of France, Germany, and Belgium the same kind of terrorist savagery that Israel had been experiencing for decades. As a consequence, Western nations found themselves increasingly dependent on Israel's vast operational and counterterrorism experience, incomparable intelligence resources, and highly developed technological sophistication. All of this achieved precisely because Israel itself is at the Hanita, the spearhead of this fight. Israel has proved to be a vital asset, not in these areas alone, but also, crucially, in the courage her leaders have frequently exhibited in taking decisive action, even in the face of concerted international opposition. In 2007, the Israeli Air Force launched Operation Orchard to destroy the Syrian nuclear reactor in the Deir el-Zor region, preventing the Assad regime from acquiring atomic weapons. Not only did this remove a game-changing weapon from the hands of a murderous despot, but also denied the possibility of nuclear material being transferred to Hezbollah and Iran, or even acquisition of such material by jihadist groups such as the Islamic State. This followed Operation Opera, an Israeli strike in 1981 that destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor under construction southeast of Baghdad. Despite global condemnation of Israel at the time, this attack was later recognized as being an important factor in enabling the US-led coalition to successfully remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait, and as with the Syria operation, prevented nuclear material falling into the hands of terrorists. More recently, Israel has taken military action to prevent Hezbollah and other radical groups operating in the civil war in Syria from acquiring chemical weaponry located in Assad's arsenals and military research centers. Israel has also acted to prevent long-range missiles from reaching Hezbollah and other terrorists, thus potentially threatening both Israelis and citizens elsewhere in the world. For many years, Western nations have depended heavily on Israeli intelligence. Civil war in Syria and the rise of the Islamic State have even further increased the West's reliance on Israeli intelligence. Israel has acted as a barrier against the further territorial expansion of the Islamic State and other Islamic terrorists in the region, including protection of Jordan and Egypt. Israel's actions to control the Islamic State expansion has also acted as a barrier against even greater waves of immigration into Europe from the Eastern Mediterranean, critical to a continent reeling from uncontrolled immigration set in motion by instability across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. Most Western countries depend heavily on Israeli military technology, including warfare systems, sensors, robotics, vehicle defensive systems, and counter-ID equipment. Israel's edge in cyber warfare is illustrated by the successful US-Israel joint venture Operation Olympic Games, which developed the Stuxnet computer worm that damaged and delayed the Iranian nuclear program, allegedly. Far more sensitive and, of course, highly classified, Israel makes a major contribution to Western nuclear defenses. And on the homeland security front, few Europeans are aware that Israeli technology safeguards such iconic symbols as Buckingham Palace, Heathrow Airport, the Eiffel Tower, and the Vatican. Most of this is about Israel's undoubted capability, but as we know who have worked in the intelligence world, action is premised on more than capability. Israel is not a vital strategic asset because of capability alone. Intent is equally important. Why did the farmers and the scouts of Hanita take such serious risks and make such sacrifices for the British in 1940? Neither they nor their fellow Jews who sustained and fought for the Eighth Army were under any obligation to do so. But nevertheless, in the 1940s, the Jews of Palestine contributed much more to the Allied war effort than all of the Arab nations combined, who between them had over 50 times the resources of the Jews. In the Middle East, only the Jews, without flinching, stood side by side with Englishmen, Australians and South Africans, facing the fearful odds presented by Rommel's overwhelming superiority. Meanwhile, the Arabs yearned to stab Britain in the back and then join the victorious Nazis in the Middle Eastern Holocaust. Of course, many Western countries also provide Israel with vital support. We are not talking here about a one-way street, but there is one aspect of the relationship that is a one-way street. Israel's spirit of cooperation with the West today is the same as the spirit of the Palestinian Jews towards Britain back in the 40s, and usually includes unequivocal public backing of its allies. While the West is too often happy to savagely and unjustly criticize and frustrate the Jewish state whenever it wishes. As Britain did with the Jewish pioneers of Hanita before coming cap in hand to ask for their help. If anything, this attitude is even worse among European countries who are equally dependent on Israel. One example illustrates this. In 2009, Italian Admiral, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but roughly, my Hebrew is better than my Italian, and it's not good, Gianpaolo Di Paolo, not bad, the chairman of NATO's military committee, visited Israel to study IDF tactics to apply to NATO operations in Afghanistan. He was particularly interested in Israeli tactics for fighting terror in civilian populated areas. The visit of this admiral came just weeks after the publication of the infamous Goldstone report, which you may have heard of, which alleged that Israel had committed war crimes by deliberately targeting civilians in Gaza. The contrast, ladies and gentlemen, was striking. Within weeks of the European Parliament endorsing the Goldstone report, the European chairman of NATO's military committee was visiting Israel for the third time in 4 years to study ethical methods for dealing with terrorist insurgencies without causing undue harm to civilians. Why do European countries exploit Israel's capabilities with one hand and stab her in the back with the other? One word sums it up: appeasement. Every European country has a large and growing Muslim population and an increasing fear of Islamic terrorism. Political leaders believe that a harsh approach towards Israel will give electoral advantage in respect of their Muslim populations and will also discourage Islamic terrorists from attacking at home. A much longer-standing target of their appeasement is the Arab world itself, and concern about the negative impact that their dealings with Israel will have on their relations with other countries in the Middle East. But the balance has been shifting, and the European diplomacy has struggled to keep up. For many years, Israel has had close strategic relations with two of its main Arab neighbors. And today, in the face of a growing fear of Iran and the rise of radical jihadism, other Arab countries are increasingly, if cautiously and quietly, looking towards Israel for protection and assistance. The Arab world will not suddenly fall in love with the Jewish state, but the sands are shifting, and in their own security interests, Western states also now need to reevaluate their relationship with Israel and what is the balance of cost and benefit for them. Perhaps the time has come, ladies and gentlemen, for a new Balfour Declaration. President Trump has called for an overhaul of NATO, which he rightly considers to be obsolete. The key to making NATO relevant in the modern world is refocusing its efforts primarily against the central strategic issue of our time, global Islamic jihad. There has been increasing cooperation in recent years between NATO and Israel, and even today there is a NATO parliamentary delegation here in Jerusalem. I watched them drinking last night in the King David Hotel. I was also drinking. The Balfour Declaration symbolized the British government's recognition of the strategic value of the Jews in Palestine in the global struggle that was then in progress. A modern-day Balfour Declaration could be recognition of the strategic value of the Jewish state in today's global struggle by full membership of a reformed NATO, which would benefit all of our strategic interests and serve also to undermine international efforts to isolate the state of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, in that respect, all of us non-Israelis who support the state of Israel and recognize how great a friend it is to us, as I've tried to explain, should be guided by the words of David Lloyd George, as I said before, the true hand behind Balfour Declaration. And he said, "This mandate for the Jewish national home must be carried out, not nervously and apologetically, but firmly and fearlessly." Thank you very much.